Good afternoon. Welcome to the third session in the MCIE and Brooks Publishing Inclusive Early Childhood Education Online Training Series. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Barb Gruber from MCIE, and I will again be your facilitator for this session. During the session, you will be muted, and you can type questions in the chat window, and they will be answered as they come up or at the end of the session. I wanted to remind you all that by joining us today, you'll hear this live presentation. There's an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the session or throughout using the chat window. You will receive a copy of the presenter's book, a certificate of attendance, and access to the recorded webinar. Now today, we have with us Kelly Wilson, and soon I hope Janice Lee. Janice is having a little trouble getting on. As soon as we get started, I'll see if I can retrieve her for you, Kelly. But the session is Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children. And a little bit about our presenters. Kelly Wilson provides training and focused support to staff, teachers, and families in the pyramid model and challenging behaviors using Prevent, Teach, Reinforce, or PTR, the PTR process. She has extensive experience as a trainer, coach, and mentor, and she specializes in challenging behavior and inclusive education. Janice Lee is a member of the research faculty at the University of Nevada, Reno, where she is the research coordinator for the randomized control trial of PTR for young children in northern Nevada. In her role with Positive Behavior Support in Nevada, she is the coordinator for the statewide initiative to bring program-wide pyramid model implementation and information to nearly all early care and education settings throughout the state. So it's my pleasure to turn this session over to you, Kelly, and I'm going to try to get Janice to join you in a moment. So let me get this up for you.
Thank you, Barb.
As we were talking, Kelly and I were talking about these nightmares of webcasts. Okay, let me find you here.
Right, and we will not be having one of those today. Those are the things other people experience.
Exactly.
And to tell you a little bit more about myself before we get started, in addition to, thanks, perfect. In addition to my professional career, I also have 4 children that have special needs, and my son, who is now 21, was one of those children that had very significantly challenging behaviors when he was 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. So a lot of this work with Prevent, Teach, Reinforce has a very personal impact in my life as well as a strong professional impact. So with that said, let's talk about Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for young children. From here on in, we'll refer to it as PTR-YC. This is a model for individualized behavior support that was developed specifically for early childhood. So I am Kelly Wilson, and I am from Colorado. Janice will be joining us shortly as soon as she's able to get on. If you have any questions as we go through, please send them through the chat box. I do like to answer people's questions as they're thinking about them. So let's talk just for a brief second about what we're going to cover today. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the purpose of PTR-YC, the background, kind of how we developed it, and why it was a focus and something that we wanted to spend time on developing. We're also going to talk about the steps of the PTR-YC model. You'll find as we go through that it's very structured and that it gives some very significant guidance on how to create behavior support plans. We're also going to look at how and when to use PTR. We've learned quite a bit about creating behavior plans and such. And then finally, if there are any questions, issues from the field, again, please feel free to share them as we go along through the chat box feature. We will also have a few moments at the end if you have questions then too. So let's start out with intensive individualized interventions. On this slide, I start out talking about the positive behavior support. However, there is a little bit more background to PBS. PBS has its origins in behavior analysis. Behavior analysis is just simply a scientific method for explaining how learning takes place. So from behavior analysis and trying to explain how behavior and how learning takes place, we move to applied behavior analysis, or ABA. ABA focused on using techniques to help shape behavior and create meaningful and positive behavior change. From applied behavior analysis, we moved more into positive behavior support. Positive behavior support builds on assessment and data collection, which we began with back when we were doing behavior analysis. It builds on how to apply those principles, and then it adds in a really strong positive component about how do we teach desirable behaviors while reducing challenging behaviors. This premise is the crux of PTR-YC. PTR-YC is positive behavior support. We also have a very strong focus on a process to help reduce challenging behaviors and at the same time increase a desirable or competent behavior. So you'll see all the way throughout PTR-YC there are two components. The first one, reduce challenging behavior. The second one, teach a new skill. And this format is straight throughout the entire process. So up next on this slide is the pyramid model. And this particular pyramid is consistent with school-wide PBS models, RTI models. The pyramid model looks at building an effective workforce. The next layer of the pyramid model in prevention is building positive relationships, high-quality supportive environments. Those fall into our preventative strategies. Our targeted teaching strategies include social and emotional competencies and how to directly teach those skills to your general classroom. All these bottom layers of the pyramid, the yellow, the blue, the green, these are all the things that we ask classrooms to have in place, and this makes up a quality environment. Children who still have challenging behaviors when all these things are in place are this intensive intervention. This is the top of the pyramid. PTR-YC, this manual was written for those children who bubble up to that top of the pyramid, those children who still need some intensive interventions. Those children for whom regularly general guidance strategies do not seem to be effective. One of the things I always like to start with when I'm working with teams is first to make sure that we all have the same understanding of what we mean when we say challenging behaviors. Challenging behaviors can be very emotional for people, so we want to make sure that we're using the same language and we're defining challenging behaviors in the same way. So the first component is a repeated pattern of behavior that interferes with learning or engagement in a pro-social interaction with peers, with adults. So there's quite a few pieces in that very first bullet. First of all, anything that interferes with learning or engagement in pro-social interactions can be considered a challenging behavior. The key word in this particular bullet is repeated. Sometimes I'll have someone call me and ask me to come in and help with challenging behaviors, and I'll ask them. They'll tell me what happened. Tommy came into school today and he hit his friend. So I'll ask them, what's the pattern of that behavior? Has he done that before? And they say no. When has he done this behavior? Tuesday. Has he ever done it again? No. So although that's a behavior that we want to address within the classroom, it's not a repeated behavior. So therefore, we would not consider that to be a challenging behavior that warrants its own intervention. Behaviors that are not responsive to the use of developmentally appropriate guidance procedures. Here I'll reflect back on the pyramid model that we just had up in the previous slide. When we're when we have schedules and routines that are in place, we're directly teaching behavior expectations. Children know what they're supposed to be doing. When we're using all the appropriate guidance measures and guidance procedures, and children are still not responding to that, then we consider that a challenging behavior. And the last bullet here, there's only one word that I want to draw our attention to. I think people are pretty good with most of these examples: prolonged tantrums, physical and verbal aggression, descriptive, vocal or motor behavior, property destruction, self-injury, noncompliance. These are all things that people very typically categorize as challenging behaviors. The piece that we often overlook is the and withdrawal. So children who are withdrawn, who are not engaging in learning, who are not engaging in prosocial interactions, we also consider this complete withdrawal and shutdown to be a challenging behavior. When we did PTR, the very first run that we did with PTR was in elementary schools, and this withdrawal behavior was a significant issue in challenging behaviors in elementary schools. So with that understanding of challenging behaviors, in the very first chapter of our book, PTRYC, we have an introduction. In the introduction, there are so many great pieces of information in that section. One of the things that we describe in great detail is principles of understanding behavior. Again, when I'm working with teams, when I'm training teams, we talk about this because this is very important to have this foundation and this general understanding together. Challenging behaviors are communication. And we talk very, very specifically about this. Challenging behaviors are not done to annoy people. They're not done to control people. Challenging behaviors are exhibited to communicate something. And our task is to find out what that behavior is communicating. The second one, challenging behaviors are maintained by their consequences. Again, this is a very challenging concept because none of us set out to support challenging behaviors. We do not go into our large group and say, I'm going to pull Tommy out of large group today. That way he has a tantrum tomorrow. We are not doing it on purpose, and the consequences that are maintaining challenging behaviors, we're usually doing that without our own awareness. So understanding that behaviors are communicating something, and our job is to figure out what they're communicating. We also need to understand that consequences maintain behavior, both challenging behavior and appropriate behavior. Third principle of understanding behavior, challenging behaviors occur in context. This means the environment impacts and supports behaviors, peers, teachers, all of us in the community support that behavior in that context. Again, when I'm training, we spend a lot of time making sure that we're all okay with the principles of understanding behavior. The next piece, or what I like to call a golden nugget in our introductory chapter of our PTRYC book, are the factors that promote effectiveness. One of the things that's most challenging for me working with challenging behaviors is when we put a lot of work and effort into something and there isn't an impact. For all of you that have done any kind of behavior plans or intensive interventions, you know that that's an investment. It's an investment of time, of resources. It is a huge commitment. And to do that and have it not be effective is very, very frustrating. So one of the things that we want to pay particular attention to before we even get rolling with the process is what are the factors within our control that can help promote how effective we will be as a team with this intervention. Clearly, prevention, very, very important. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. High-quality classrooms, high-quality environments, directly teaching skills, directly teaching behavior, expectations. All of these have an impact on effectiveness. Commitment to successful outcomes. Surface level, this one sounds pretty simple, but what we really mean by commitment to successful outcomes, we really mean are all team members willing to take those extra steps and put in that extra effort to help shape that behavior. Oftentimes in shaping behaviors, we are going to need to put in a little bit more work up front. I like to call it front loading. So are all the members of that team committed and willing to front load and to put in that extra effort up front? Fidelity of implementation. We've studied fidelity a lot. Fidelity just simply means, are we doing this intervention the way it was designed to be done? So fidelity of implementation measures how well we as a team are implementing the strategies. Are we using the right language? Are we using it at the right time? Are we all reinforcing? Are we being consistent? Those kinds of things really impact the effectiveness of your intervention. Now with PTRYC, the interventions should be robust enough that you don't have to implement to perfection. We have to implement about 80% or better, and then you should see a very effective intervention when you're implementing to fidelity. Capacity of the team has a couple components. One main component with team capacity is the commitment of each team member to make this plan work. How committed are we to making this plan be successful and helping this child to become successful? That probably is the number one factor related to capacity of the team. The second most important factor would be the knowledge and experience on the team. Is there anybody that has knowledge and experience of behavior analysis, of functional behavior assessments, of how to use data to drive interventions and collect data to monitor progress? And then lastly, on factors that promote effectiveness, we have family involvement. All of you working in settings know that sometimes family involvement comes easy and sometimes it's a challenge, and sometimes we never get it. Here's my suggestion around family involvement. We try to involve families at every single step of implementation. We'll look a little bit more into detail on that one when we look at the chapter on families. Prevent, teach, reinforce. This is the first model that we started out with. The first branch that we had to test out prevent, teach, reinforce was in elementary schools. So we essentially developed a process that we had on sheets of paper with big alligator clips on them, and we thought it would be interesting to see if we took the principles of positive behavior support and applied them in a systematic method, if that would have a bigger impact on the outcome of the intervention. So we put together these 5 steps in the first book, PTR, Prevent, Teach, Reinforce, and then we went out and just started cold calling principals of elementary schools and saying, hey, give us your hardest kids, and we will pay you, the school, the families, and the teachers to allow us to come in and help you with those children. We broke a fax machine. So many nominations came in. So we set out into elementary schools and targeted children who had the most challenging behaviors in those schools. And what we did is we worked with the team, and the team had to be willing, again, capacity of team, they had to be willing to invest in having 4 meetings prior to implementation. This is a hard sell in elementary schools when we're asking people to meet 4 times before we have an intervention to put in place. However, for the teams that were willing to do that, and there were many, we had great success with being able to change and shape behaviors in elementary schools. From there, we had the conversation about how great it would be to use practices like PTR for preschool settings. As you know, it's not really possible to take PTR for school age and just modify it for preschool. So then we looked at how can we utilize the principles and the steps of the PTR process that worked so well in elementary and middle schools, and how can we create a model that would be effective utilizing PTR for preschools and young children. And that's where PTRYC came into play. The original PTR had 5 chapters. In this book, we've expanded it and we've added a couple more things. So we'll talk briefly about some of the features in PTRYC, and then we'll start looking at the process and the steps and what that looks like. keep in mind that typically when I train on PTRYC, 3 hours is tight. I usually like to spend about 2 days in workshops developing the PTR process. So you are most certainly getting an overview. So PTRYC has been developed specifically for preschool settings and young children that have challenging behavior. Now remember, back to our definition, these are repeated behaviors that interfere with learning and interfere with engagement in pro-social interactions. They can be any of those: prolonged tantrums, aggressive behaviors, withdrawal kinds of behaviors. Part of PTRYC, once we get through some of our introductory places, so we talk about here are factors that promote effective implementation, here are things that will promote the plan and planning and engage families. In addition to that, we have very detailed steps that help us get through the process of designing and implementing interventions that have a direct relationship to the function of behavior. And some of the steps involved in this process are teaming and setting goals. We then look at setting up a data collection system. The data collection helps us first determine our baseline, but then it also helps us monitor our progress through the entire process. The next step is a functional behavior assessment, and that's where we're gathering our information and data about when the behavior occurs, why the behavior occurs, and what consequences are maintaining that behavior. And then at our 4th meeting, we start developing that intervention plan. After our 4th meeting, step 5 is to implement in the classroom or in the setting. And then after that, we have a few extra steps that focus on follow-up. Are we making progress, and what do we do next? Some other features of PTR. We have created an assessment tool, a functional assessment tool specific to young children and early childhood, and that's our PTR functional assessment. We've also developed a menu list of interventions with descriptions that talk about what the intervention is, how it works, and most importantly, what are things you need to consider if you're using this strategy to implement. So we have a question about functional behavior assessment and whether it aligns with the requirements of IDEA, and the functional behavior assessment is completely aligned with IDEA. It is aligned with the principles of positive behavior support, applied behavior analysis. All behavior interventions, when we develop our intervention plan, all behavior interventions have 3 components. There is a focus on a strategy for prevention, for teaching, and for reinforcing. So all behavior plans will contain a prevent, a teach, and a reinforce component. With that being said, we also, remember I said we have 2 focuses. One is to decrease challenging behaviors, and one is to teach that new skill or increase the desired behavior. So decreasing challenging behavior will have a prevent, teach, reinforce component, and increasing or teaching a new skill will have a prevent, teach, reinforce component. The main thing I love about this process and what I think makes a big difference with this process is that it is team-driven and decisions are made collaboratively. When people understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, they're a whole lot more likely to implement things to fidelity and to implement things with a commitment to making it happen and getting success. A couple other features with our manual. Steps are very much scripted, but the content and the focus and the function are the pieces that will change within each intervention. So it's scripted, but it's scripted in such a way that it allows for all of that individualization that is necessary with every individualized support plan. All the steps, so each chapter and each meeting ends with an evaluation, a self-evaluation to make sure We've done the pieces that we need to do. When we get to interventions, there's a menu of interventions, which is really fantastic. The menu is broken up into prevent strategies, teaching strategies, and reinforcement strategies. The entire process is manualized. One of the main things that we want to emphasize with PTRYC is that if you're going to put in the time and the investment to create a behavior plan, then we should pay special attention to implementing it with fidelity. So if we're going to put the time and effort into creating it, we're also going to put some effort into making sure we're implementing it the way we're supposed to. One other major feature that I absolutely love about this manual is the case studies. Embedded in every single chapter are 4 case studies, and each case study will take you through. So once you do teaming and goal setting, at the end of that chapter, there are 4 different examples of what teaming and goal setting can look like. These 4 examples go through every single chapter all throughout the book. I can tell you on a side note, that is very challenging for researchers to do because your case studies cannot be based on anything that's real, so it all has to be made up. So imagine, if you will, taking a researcher like myself and saying, I want you to make this up. Very challenging. In any event, it is one of the best features of the book because it takes the content that you've just learned about and it immediately applies it to a situation. So I do suggest that you take a moment to look through that. Very, very helpful. So the chapters. Introduction, I've talked a lot about that. That's where you'll find understanding principles of behavior, factors that promote effectiveness. The next chapter is about families. I'm going to talk real briefly about families, and then we're going to dive into the rest of the book, which is getting ready, teaming and goal setting, how we do our data, the PTR assessment, PTRYC assessment, the intervention, and then using our data. So in a moment, I will turn it over to Janice, and she will take you through the steps. Roles of families. Again, we said steps are teaming and goal setting, data collection, PTRYC functional assessment, PTRYC intervention, and then using your data to connect to next steps. Here's how we see the roles of families. In step one, we encourage teams to try to engage parents as partners in teaming, partners in goal setting. In step 2, when we're doing our data, we again encourage teams to engage families as consultants. They can give fantastic information and data about behavior. In step 3, when we're doing our functional assessment tool, we engage parents as informants, helping us gather information so that we can develop a PTRYC intervention plan. In step 4, we look at engaging families as teachers and actually taking that role and responsibility of teaching and shaping new behaviors. And then in step 4, when we have that intervention, we're implementing it, now we can engage parents as collaborators. How's it going? What kind of progress are we making? What are our next steps? I encourage people to try to engage families at every single step. If you can't get parents engaged at step 1, try again at step 2, and so on and so on. One of the key factors that impact effectiveness of implementation is engagement and involving families. So I would say try hard to continue those efforts to engage parents at every step of the implementation. Okay, last thing before we jump into the steps and the stages of PTRYC, we need to talk a little bit about universal classroom practices. When we were writing PTRYC, one of the things we talked about most often that happened with the first PTR in elementary school was that once we started implementing strategies that were based on classroom practice, sometimes we didn't even need to create an individualized intervention. So when we are implementing classroom practices and we're doing them at a high fidelity, sometimes the need for these intensive interventions go away. And with that said, we know that there are 5 classroom practices that have a very strong impact on behavior. A ratio of positive to negative attention. If we can get 5 deposits, 5 positive attentions to any one negative, a negative can be a question, a demand, a request. We can shift that so that we're focusing on the positives in a ratio of 5 to 1, incidences of challenging behaviors greatly decrease. Next, really big bang classroom practice, using predictable and comprehensive schedules and routines. If we have schedules and we have routines that make sense, again, this one in particular often does away with the need for a lot of individualized behavior plans. Routines within routines, making sure that our circle has a clear beginning, middle, and end and is predictable. Teaching behavior expectations directly, again, greatly reduces the need for children to communicate through challenging behaviors. And directly teaching social skills and emotional competencies too can greatly decrease challenging behaviors. In PTRYC, I strongly suggest spending some time with these classroom practices. There's a lot of narrative about what that means and what it looks like. Before you even complete the PTR assessment, it's going to ask you if you're implementing these 5 classroom practices to fidelity. And if you can say no to any of these, the recommendation is go back and teach those behavior expectations, and then we'll do a behavior plan. Very, very important to us that we look at those general classroom practices. And with that said, let me introduce Janice Lee, and I'll hand it over to Janice, and she'll walk us through the PTRYC steps.
I don't have any sound for Janice.
Nope, I'm not hearing Janice either.
Janice, I know you can hear us. Can you enter your audio pin? I think that's what you need to do. I'm going to type it to you. So let me see. But why don't you go ahead, Kelly, and just keep going.
Okay. Okay, so PTRYC, the steps. Once we have engaged families, the next step that we're looking at is teaming and goal setting. Teaming and goal setting, what we really are trying to do at this step is we want to identify one challenging behavior to target to begin with and one appropriate or pro-social behavior to target and begin with. This can be really challenging when you have pages and pages of challenging behaviors that you want to focus on. As far as what's the best behavior to focus on, that's going to vary and that's going to change. I think the important piece of that is to target a challenging behavior that you're all committed to and you're all willing to focus on decreasing that challenging behavior, and then again identify an appropriate skill to teach that's related to that challenging behavior. One of the methods that we use to do that is the PTRYC goal sheet. And on here, the very first box gives you space to brainstorm, to list all the behaviors that you want to see decrease. Now, I've worked with some teams that say that box is not going to accommodate all the behaviors we're thinking of. In that case, you can take another sheet of paper and add it on. But first, we want you to look at what are the behaviors that we want to decrease. Then, as a team, using a consensus process, we want to go through and pick out a target behavior. It could be a behavior that's very aggressive, and that might be the one we want to target. That one might have the biggest impact on that child's ability to interact with peers in the classroom. So you might want to target that one. There could be a chain of behaviors. There could be a couple of behaviors that a child does consecutively. For my son, Colin, he used to make this squeaky noise. And it was like, and when he started making that squeaky noise, then we knew that something was not going right with Colin. If we didn't intervene, he would start ripping papers, breaking pencils. If we still didn't do anything, then he would hit other children. So for Colin, he had this progression of behaviors that started with a squeaky noise, moved into property destruction, and then aggression toward peers. In a case like that where there's a clear pattern, you might want to start with one that is at the beginning of that pattern, and then all the other behaviors won't be relevant. So the first goal is to write out the behaviors to decrease, decide as a team what behavior you want to target, and then you want to operationally define what behavior you're going to target. Your next step is going to be to write out behaviors that you would want to increase that are related to that challenging behavior. So what would you want to see that child doing instead of the challenging behavior? Again, here we're going to write out a target behavior, and then we're going to write an operational definition for that behavior. Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Yes.
This is Janice. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
we
have
Janet.
you.
Welcome.
Oh, sorry. All right.
Welcome, Janice.
Up and then we'll go on.
Yes, you want to jump in at practical data collection, the next slide?
Perfect.
Right. Here's an example of a PTRYC goal sheet, and as you can see, there's a bunch of behaviors listed in the behaviors to decrease. The behavior this team chose to target was hitting others. It's a pretty aggressive behavior. It has pretty significant consequences in the classroom, so they chose that one. And then the operational definition was Joel will hit teachers and peers, usually with an open hand. So now we know exactly what that behavior looks like, and that's the behavior that we're going to target to decrease. Behaviors to increase, again, a nice long list. The target behavior was focused on participating in classroom activities, and the operational definition, when presented with a non-preferred activity, Joel will actively participate in the activity for a minimum of 2 minutes. So the purpose of the goal sheet is to help operationally define what the challenging behavior is that we want to decrease and what the replacement skill or new skill is that we want to teach. Now, I will mention at this point, sometimes it's hard to know exactly what is the skill that we want to be teaching. So this is a piece that might change when you start implementing or you've done your functional behavior analysis. You might come back and say, you know what, actually it's not about classroom activities. It's more about following directions. So at that point, you do have the flexibility to change that targeted skill to teach. But we don't want to save that piece because we want to be getting data on that straight out of the gate as baseline data. Okay, and here's Janice.
Okay, we will try this again. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Janice, and thank you for your patience with our technical challenges. Even though we practiced, apparently I'm still more technically challenged than I had thought. So thanks, Kelly, for filling in for me there. And I just wanted to follow up too with the goal setting. You know, a lot of teams that I work with, they're concerned, or for many kids that we work with, there are kids that have multiple challenging behaviors, and so sometimes it's hard for teams to identify one to start with, and that can be really difficult for getting buy-in and looking at team capacity, for example. But what I try to reassure my teams, and so for those people who are on this webinar or who may listen to it later, who may be in a facilitative kind of role, is encourage teams to really look at, okay, let's prioritize, let's find some effective strategies that are going to work, and then we will, make sure to address the following behaviors also. And generally with many teams that I work with, what ends up happening is that some of those other behaviors that we didn't originally target start to improve because the general environment and the context in which the kids and the teachers are functioning are improving also. And so we get a lot of, behavior improvement for free or without as much effort. And so again, even for teachers who may be listening too, don't think that that's not going to happen. The whole point of this process is to be able to look at decreasing challenging behavior within a shorter period of time, and we're talking about 2 to 3 months. That's really what we're looking at for this whole process. And so knowing that we're going to be continuing to move forward. So hopefully, that's a thing that comes up often, and I want to kind of ease people's issues with that. Okay, so the data collection piece, again, we say practical data collection. We want it to be easy and feasible for teams to collect. And so what we've identified are two methods. So using a behavior rating scale, which I'll show you those if you're not familiar with them, and we'll talk about them here in just a minute, or frequency counts. And so the rationale is that if many teachers may already be collecting frequency counts, like tally marks, for example, or counting how many times something might happen during the day. So kind of the recommendation is that if teams are using that they should continue with that because they're already collecting some sort of data. Now, the large majority of our teams aren't collecting data at all, and so we kind of get them started with the behavior rating scale. And basically, again, because this is a collaborative process, the team gets to identify what's going to be collected, when it's going to be collected, and who's going to do it. And so, again, we want something that's easy for classroom staff to collect. For people that do have familiarity with data collection, it's often very cumbersome and time-consuming. And so, again, we want it to be easy, accurate, and measure what it's intended to measure. So some people may be familiar with a rating scale. It's basically a Likert scale on a scale of 1 to 5. And this is the blank form that would be in the book. And then we wanted to show you just a quick example because I think this makes it a little bit easier to understand in terms of how that would be. So basically, you take your goals that you've identified from your goal sheet. So what you identified as your desirable behavior would go at the bottom where it says desirable behavior. So for our case example, Joel in the book, his is to participate in activities, and then the challenging behavior, which we took straight from the goal sheet, is hitting others. Now, for typically what I do with teams is we start with the challenging behavior piece because that's generally easier, and the team identifies what do they want to measure. And so the manual gives guidance around kind of identifying that too. So for Joel's case, for example, they thought frequency count or counting how many times he's hitting others would be the most meaningful for them. And so generally we say, okay, on average, how many times might it happen during the day? Some teachers and teams can identify that pretty readily, others can't, so we just estimate, and we would make that. So for example, if they say, oh, I think he hits, at least 10 times in a day, then that's where we would put our number 5 is hits 10 or more. Okay, if it's more than that, that's fine, we can measure that. It doesn't necessarily have to be super precise and exact for our purposes here. And then we kind of rate or anchor the other numbers, so what the 4, the 3, the 2, and the 1, how teams just pick those. What's going to be meaningful for a teacher or a classroom staff person to be able to rate during the day. Now, a number 1 doesn't necessarily have to be 0, but this is something that works for this team. And then the basic premise is that at the end of the day or at the end of the observation period, whatever that might be, then the teacher or whoever's identified to collect the data is going to circle a number at the end of the day. So you're not taking data on each instance of behavior, where this is a perceptual rating, so you're looking at the end of the day or at the end of the morning, whatever the team identifies for how long they're going to track things. In general, how would you rate the day? And so that's, probably the easiest way to describe that. And so for some teams, they might just converse real quick. I saw him hit 3, I saw him hit 2, so he, it's 5, so we would circle a number 3 for that day. Okay, again, it's for the full period. And then you would do the same for the desirable behavior. And so this is generally the harder part for teams to identify is how they're going to measure the desirable behavior that you want to see. Now, as Kelly mentioned, for some teams it may be difficult to figure out what that behavior is, and that may change. But at this point, what we like to do is be tracking, is any of this happening? And what we've seen with quite a few kids that we've been working with so far is that sometimes the desirable behavior that we're really targeting ends up happening more than people even acknowledged happened before or even thought was happening at all. So sometimes this can be really eye-opening for teams to say, oh, he really is doing more than I thought. That's not always the case, but sometimes that is occurring. And so, again, the team would be looking at how they're going to anchor the numbers and how they're going to identify what each number means. So it's not just a random ranking score, but you have something to anchor that to or to identify what those numbers do mean. And then again, for each day, you would circle a number. And so for a 5-day-a-week program, this sheet would give you data for a whole month if you had a child who was going to school or to your center 5 days in a week, which is common, but not always. Okay, so that's the data collection piece. You would be starting data generally as soon as you fill out the form. And you could start it either that day or the following day. And then, as Kelly mentioned, that you would continue to collect data on that same sheet from the beginning. Sorry, I'm going to go back really quick. Another quick thing I do want to mention, because I know we're getting short on time, is that, you know, this is not set in stone. If you try it out in your classroom and you're like, oh, this is really not working for us, it's really not capturing what we want it to capture, or it's not accurate enough, you can always adjust the scale, but make sure you do that as soon as you possibly can. If it's not really reflecting how you're feeling, or again, if it's not measuring what you want it to be measuring, if it's not showing you how you're feeling about it within the classroom. And then again, this is the same data that you're going to continue to take before you start intervention and then once you start intervention. All right, so then the third step is the functional behavior assessment piece that Kelly talked about. And again, this does align with any IDEA requirements. Most states have laws around functional behavior assessment in order to develop behavior intervention plans for children. And so this does fit in there. As it was mentioned before, PTRYC is a method of positive behavior support. So again, any of the law around that, this should meet that. Now, some programs may have a certain form that they have to use. I think that that's okay, but you know what we provided is out there. And so our functional behavior assessment checklist that I'll show you here in a minute is an indirect measure. And so what we know is that the teachers, the adults who are familiar with the child generally have a good understanding of the behavior. Now, it's not to say that direct observation isn't helpful either, but in terms of being efficient and getting through this process and getting as much information as possible, we generally can do that using this checklist method. And so the forms that I'll show you here in just a second can be filled out either individually or as a team, depending on how the teams function. But again, this is how you can engage other team members who may or may not be able to attend a meeting. They can still provide input. So this could also include families, although we don't always recommend that you just send the forms home to families because they may not quite understand what the purpose is behind them. You know, that information can be asked of them by phone, in an email, via text messaging, you know, kind of, or in person, depending on kind of what the team configuration is. And again, our goal is to gather as much relevant information about the challenging behavior as we possibly can. So this is what the checklist looks like. It's basically a series of questions. There's 3 different checklists. This is the prevent checklist. And basically the idea is to ask questions around the challenging behavior. When is it more likely to happen? When is it least likely to happen? And under what context? Are there specific activities where it's more likely to happen? Are there specific activities when challenging behavior may or may not doesn't occur at all? Are there certain people who are associated with that? You know, and it starts looking at what are some of the environmental factors that are happening. The second checklist is the teach checklist, and the first several questions are around identifying the function or the purpose behind the challenging behavior. Why do you think the child is engaging in this behavior? What are they trying to communicate? So do you think they're trying to get attention from other kids, from adults? Are they trying to get something or to have that go away? Are they trying to delay going to a non-preferred activity? And so that's what those initial questions are about. And then the subsequent questions are looking at what skills are missing, what skills would be helpful for this child in order to reduce the challenging behavior. And so for many of kids that we work with, sometimes teachers are like, oh, they can use all of these skills. But that's very telling that, you know, again, challenging behavior communicates, and so it's often the reason why they lack those skills, which is the result of their challenging behavior. The third checklist is the reinforced checklist, and so this is looking at a couple of things. The questions are around how do people currently respond to the challenging behavior? What are the current consequences for that? And also, what's reinforcing to the child? What is the child like? What are his or her preferences? And what's the likelihood that the child's behaviors, either inappropriate or appropriate, are going to result in some sort of feedback or responding from either other kids and peers or other adults in the room. So that's what these are the blank checklists. And then what we provided is just an easy summary table to summarize the information from those checklists. And then from there, you would input the information, and then at the very bottom, you would develop a hypothesis statement. So looking at all the evidence that you've gathered, coming up with what's our hypothesis statement, what's our best educated guess around why we think the challenging behavior is occurring, and what are the current consequences that maintain it or continue to keep that going. So in the interest of time, I did show, these are some examples, again, from our case example of Joel, of what it might look like filled out. And again, there's a lot, for the first and second checklist, there are, I believe, 9 questions. And normally I would have taken more time to go over these things, but you can just see how they're filled out. We just check them off. Each of the questions has an other, so if the actual fill-in options aren't relevant, then people can add additional information as well. And that gives teams lots of extra good information to include in terms of their understanding of the challenging behavior. The teach checklist for Joel, again, we don't have a lot of time to look at all of the things, but I wanted to just briefly show you what that might look like. And then the summary table. And so I know this may be difficult to read on the screen, but the information is summarized, and then the hypothesis statement for Joel is when Joel is asked to participate in their arrival activities, then he will begin hitting peers and or adults. And as a result, he gets attention through reprimands, redirects, talking about what happened, or restating rules. And so often that adult attention is a common function for kind of why kids are engaging in challenging behavior, and sometimes that can be for a variety of reasons, but basically, attentive adults will respond when kids are struggling, and so that makes sense, right? So as Kelly mentioned before around sometimes it's inadvertent in terms of the way adults are responding, but again, that's a big call to say, okay, what skills is Joel missing, and how can we identify what those skills are and then teach them to him so that he can be more successful. All right, so we finally get to the place of identifying strategies after we've gone through all of that. And this is always where people want to start. And so again, as Kelly said, getting people to hop on board and say, okay, we're going to have like 3 or 4 meetings before we actually start identifying intervention strategies. That can be really, really tough for people. But depending on the team, sometimes we can get to this point in a couple of weeks. For other teams, it might take 3 or 4 weeks to get here also. So again, depending on people's schedules and how people work together, we can get there. So the menu has intervention options with complete descriptions. Again, there's the 3 categories. I'll show you the menu here in just a minute. And the plans should include at least 1 intervention from each category. Okay, so this is the PTR menu. There are prevention strategies, teaching strategies, and reinforced strategies. Now, in the manual, in the appendix, each strategy has a complete description. Again, it gives considerations, when you might consider using the strategy, how you might do it, and then we gave several examples of how you could implement that particular strategy in a variety of different routines and activities and in a variety of different ways, given the child's current level of skill. So again, we don't have a ton of time to go over them, but again, you're going to want to pick at least 1 strategy from each category to implement. And then you have to develop the plan from there. So it's not just identifying strategies, but it's planning for and literally writing out all of the aspects of the implementation. So you're going to describe the steps you're going to use. Are you going to need materials? What are the specific directions? And then what we did is provided a summary form, hopefully that is helpful to teams. And basically this is kind of like the cheat sheet to the behavior intervention plan. That's kind of how we intended it, so that typically, I don't know, for a lot of people, but typically for me, for teams that I've worked with over the years, once the intervention plan is written, it's very rare that people actually ever look at it or read it again. So again, this can be kind of a cheat sheet to help people identify, okay, what are the strategies that we identified as a team, and what are some specific notes or implementation notes that we might need. And then at the top are the classroom practices. So is the team going to be implementing some of those as well simultaneously? This is just a screenshot of one of the part of Joel's behavior intervention plan, and I kind of zoomed it in a little bit so that people can see that, and the intervention plan can look differently depending on where you come from. So typically school district programs might have a specific form that they have to use, whereas a private program or center or even a Head Start may or may not have particular form that they might use for a behavior intervention plan. So in our case examples, we showed a different variety of ways that might look. But I think the biggest piece is when you look at the strategies, for this particular case, we numbered them. So we basically said step by step, what is the adult going to do based on Joel's behaviors. And so for the prevent strategy is to provide choices and use visual supports and schedules. So we identified what materials were needed, and then basically an adult will meet Joel at the door and follow the next 6 steps. So it's literally step by step. And so that way, in terms of the fidelity piece or making sure that people truly understand what we mean about providing choice, that they can follow those particular pieces. So just a quick look at what the behavior intervention plan summary would look like for Joel. Again, this can be very helpful for classroom staff in terms of being visual reminder or visual prompt about what they're going to be doing. And then we're not even to the point where we're implementing, but we need to do a little bit of prep and we have some questions. So do we need to do some training? Is there coaching or ongoing support that's going to be needed? If so, who is going to do it? When is it going to occur? How often? And so many teams will maybe do some role playing around the implementation plan to say, okay, I think we've figured out all of the details. And then the teacher and the classroom staff can say, okay, we're ready to implement this tomorrow, for example. And then also there should be a plan for when is the data going to be reviewed. So how long is the team going to commit to implementing it before they're ready to say whether or not things are either getting better or not changing or getting worse. We also have a fidelity of strategy implementation form, which basically helps teams identify, are we implementing our plan as intended? And so again, this is just a quick example of what it might look like as it's filled out. So you just look at what the individual steps are, and then you can track that. So we can use that for a variety of ways. I know we're really short on time, so I'm going to go a little bit faster. So then in terms of database decision making, we want to compare some trends in terms of our baseline or when we started taking data to once we start the intervention. So we want to, on our data sheet, identify when we started implementing particular strategies. And basically what we know and what we've been seeing is that challenging behavior should be improved within the first few days of implementing those individualized strategies. But for most of our kids, we're seeing improvement generally within a couple of days. So that's been pretty consistent. And basically, the more that teams are ready to go straight out of the gate and know what they're supposed to be doing, the quicker that those changes really do occur. The progress monitoring in terms of the data needs to be simple and make sure that it's reflecting how we want things to be going. If things are going well, keep going, but we do want to caution not to fade supports too quickly because that basically happens a lot. And then if the progress continues to maintain, you can add elements to the plan or fade supports. And if you start seeing challenging behaviors start to come back again, you might, if you're already fading supports, you may want to slow that down or return to your original plan that hopefully was working. There are, in the manual, there's lots of guidance around if progress isn't going well. There are different things that you can be looking at. And then just really quickly, this is just an example of some of the data that was part of Joel's case example. And so again, since we're running out of time, I'm going to quickly go through here, but I tried to show kind of looking at some trends across the different phases. And so, we want to make sure to share with families, share successes with colleagues, make sure we meet periodically. And just as a summary, PTRYC is positive behavior support, and so again, it does meet all of that criteria. The whole main purpose around PTRYC is to enhance and make it easier to use and implement the process, and also to increase the fidelity of implementation to improve outcomes. And again, as Kelly talked a lot about, is that the classroom personnel commitment is the essential factor in making this happen. And so with that, I don't know if we have any questions, but I think we might have 30 seconds.
And you can have 30 seconds. Thank you for persevering and getting yourself on the, the audio working. If there are any questions, you can type them in the chat box. Lots of really great information, and I know people will be glad to receive their books if they haven't already.
Yes, I think one other thing that I would like to mention is, obviously when you get the manual, hopefully you will read it, but that's something we always recommend, even when people come to any session or workshop that we hold, is that, we're only giving you kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of the information, but really look through the manual and go through it. We took a lot of care to put as much information as possible in there to assist people in this process.
I think the emphasis on, having those 3 or 4 planning meetings before you actually do anything it's really great advice, because we always want to jump into it, but without a really good plan. So that was very good. And the fidelity piece, getting people to do things with fidelity, is also sometimes difficult, but very, very important.
It's worth the time investment.
Yes, you make it sound like it is. I am going to want to thank you both for a great session. I apologize again, Janice, for the technology snafu, but you were able to rise above it. And I want to thank the audience we had quite a large audience today, which was great. I'll be following up with you about today's session probably in a little bit here, and sending the recording and the PowerPoint slides. And if you missed a previous session and you've watched it and want a certificate of attendance, you can let me know. I'm kind of keeping an eye on that and trying to get them out as I see people have caught up. But if you have any questions or concerns, you can email me at barb@mcie.org. So, okay. Thanks again, ladies. And everybody else, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.